You're listening to Coding Blocks, episode 65. Subscribe to us and leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app.
And check us out at codingblocks.net where you can find show notes, examples, discussion, and more.
Send your feedback, questions, and rants to comments at codingblocks.net. Follow us on Twitter at codingblocks or head to www.codingblocks.net and find all our social links there at the top of the page. I'm Alan Underwood.
I'm Joe Zach.
And I'm Michael Outlaw.
All right, first up, we got a bit of news. So big thanks for the reviews as always. This time we're appreciating from iTunes, Barkadude, Robert JF, Meager Findings, Whiskey Coder, SB Slack, Sungmeister, Student Boy 87, Flotman, Wee Java Dude, and Naraf.
And on Stitcher, we have Whiskey Coder, Dance to Die, and Captain Kippers.
Woo. Thank you very much. Hey, did you hit record on the video?
Yep.
Okay, cool, because I forgot it in the last couple times.
Did you happen to notice that one of those was said twice?
I think I did previously. Who was it? Was it Dance to Die? No. I don't know. Where was it? Whiskey Coder.
It was, Whiskey Coder, yep.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for doing that. All right, and as always, for the full show notes for this particular episode, you can go up to our website. The most recent should be there at the top, but if not, go to www.codingblocks.net/episode 65. And so let's go ahead and get started with a little bit of news here. And the first one is I had promised that I was going to do a video on the specification pattern because it seemed a little confusing when we were talking about it on the show. And I have done said promised video now. So I'll have a link to the show notes or in the show notes here for that video up on YouTube. It's a little bit long, just stick it on 1.5x and blow through it. I do have links to GitHub on the video description so that you can see the actual code for the patterns library that I put together, which has got the specification pattern, as well as the sample code that I was going through in the video. So both of those are there. So do go check that out when you get a chance. Yeah.
In fairness, what are you calling long?
I think it's 26 minutes. Is it? I don't know.
I call that out only because someone else pointed out the Pluralsight course, and it's an hour and a half.
For the specification pattern?
Yes. For the one pattern.
All right, so you can get a real nice preview.
So just consider yours is already being played at 3 times.
That's right. That's awesome. I actually I haven't seen that other course, and mine's, I guess it's sort of brief, but yeah, 26 minutes is a little amount of time to go through, but hopefully it'll help somebody out and maybe clear the waters a little.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about my headphones. So I got new headphones, and I'm definitely not the sound spurt that Alan is. But I got the Logitech G633. I got some reverbs for what I thought was a pretty good deal. It turned out to be just kind of normal, darn you, Amazon. But I wanted to mention here because they have a really cool feature where they have a 35 millimeter jack and a USB.
Very nice.
And you can have both on at the same time.
Oh, at the same time?
Yes. Amazing. I know.
Wait,
what that means for me, say what?
You can have both the audio, the 3.5 millimeter plus the USB at the same time, but why would I want that?
So for me, working from home and doing a lot of Skyping, some days a lot of Skyping, I listen to music on my phone. And so normally I used to just have kind of the phone plugged into some earbuds, and when it was Skype time, I would kind of hurry up and take the headphones off, grab my USB headphones, and get on the call and tweak the levels and stuff. But now it's so nice to when the BringBring, let's talk about something. I just kind of hit answer, and I've already got the headphones on. And what's funny is I thought it would kind of stop the music on the iPhone, but it doesn't. So it just kind of keeps going. I think it lowers it quite a bit. But it's still kind of funny when your boss calls to talk about to have a talk, and you've got Disco Inferno in the background.
But it does lower it though. So you got some nice background music while your boss is chewing you out. That's kind of good.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just there staying alive while he's
They definitely look like something that you would see in a Tron movie.
You can control the lights too. You can pick the colors. You can do whether they breathe or whether they change colors or flow.
That's really cool. So yeah, definitely
Yeah.
go check that out. We'll have a link here in the show notes for that as well. And also, I do want to give a tip for that because, man, I get hit up a lot on Slack on, hey, does anybody have any headphone recommendations? And of course, I have lots, but I will say this. If you want to go try them out, now in-ears, you're stuck. If you want in-ears, you're not going to be able to try those out anywhere. Nobody's going to let you do it because they don't want them in your ears because then they can't sell them, right? But over the ears or on ears, a lot of people think Best Buy and all that, and certainly that's a good place to go. Another place you can go is the Apple Store. If there's one near you, they almost always have a set of or several sets of different types of headphones available. But one that a lot of people don't think about if you're not into playing instruments is a Guitar Center, or I don't know, is Mars Music even a thing anymore?
Got bought out, I think, by Sam Ash.
Okay, so Sam Ash. So Guitar Center, Sam Ash, go in there. Like typically they have some really nice headphones for sale that you know, anywhere from seriously $30 up to like 200, but you can try out a bunch of different headphones. And one of my favorite sets there is the Audio Technica M50s, the M50X specifically. You know, you can go into those places and try them out and see what they sound like. So little tip.
Oh, okay, I got to bring this up. Sorry to derail. I was listening to the latest Reply All. It's the one where like the first part of the episode, the guy someone calls him on his phone and says, "Hey, your phone's or your computer's infected. Let's hop on." And you know, it's a scam. And anyway, he ends up going over to India to kind of investigate, and he ends up running into a headphone bar. Which, have you ever heard of a headphone bar?
No.
Yeah, I hadn't either. Apparently, there are bars, at least in India, where you go in and you kind of rent headphones and listen to music on your headphones. And you can, so it's like kind of silent inside, right? But you've got people walking around and maybe they're listening to one of the same three DJs. Maybe they're like listening to, you know, something else. Or maybe they're just hanging out in the quiet. I just thought it was like a totally bizarre thing to think about, you know, this kind of silent room with people still kind of dancing and shouting at each other.
That is odd. I'm going to be looking this up. I'm sure there's videos on YouTube.
Yeah, maybe we'll start one. Hey.
Yeah, there we go.
Kennesaw Headphone Bar.
So what you got up next?
I was just looking at this headphone bar thing.
Yeah. He has me more intrigued by these headphones, these G633s, you said?
Yep. I paid $70. It looks like Amazon's got them for $89 today. When I thought I was getting a super deal, they were around $100 on Amazon, but I should have checked out like Camel or something.
And they're comfortable?
They're a little tight on my head, but I just kind of grin and bear it.
The mic
and I wear them
good?
for like 6 hours. Oh, yeah. It's got some bass. It's got 7.1 too, so surround sound.
You said the magic word.
He doesn't care about treble. It's all about that bass.
Yep. Which is so odd that song has none.
It really has none. It's terrible representation.
For a song that's all about it.
All right, so next up, what you got, Jay-Z?
All right. Book club. This is something we've talked about a lot of times in the Slack channel and the books channel. The ability to basically read a book together and kind of talk about it. And I've looked at a couple sites. They're definitely, if you look for like online book club, you'll find a bunch, but it's always like Oprah Book Club or somebody else's book club where they kind of, you know, pick a book and everyone reads it and there's a forum. And what I kind of like would be to have some sort of like location or something where you could kind of have like an existing forum so that if somebody can come along, you know, a year after the fact, read and still kind of get involved in like the forum. So I didn't know if anything like that existed. So I just want to kind of put the call out there. I've got a couple suggestions, a couple things on Twitter to kind of run down that I wanted to look into. So, you know, maybe this has already been answered and I just don't know it. But I just thought it was kind of interesting. And if that's something that you'd be interested in, just kind of let us know somehow. It's something we're definitely talking about. I'd really like doing it. And actually, I think that the original idea came from Dance to Die. So I'm also a big reader of his blog. So
awesome. Excellent.
Yep.
All right, so my next piece of news, I just found this out the other day when I was creating the video for the specification pattern because you guys ever notice or have you just completely blocked it out now? Like when you open up Visual Studio, there's usually the recent news or whatever section that's in that window. Like it's almost like when you know that there's something and you've seen it so many times you walk by it, that's usually me. But for whatever reason, this caught my attention the other day, probably because I was in Visual Studio 2017 for Mac. And I saw this announcement that .NET Core 2.0 was out for Microsoft. So it's actually officially been released, I think, as of yesterday, as a matter of fact. So along with that, and I've got a link to the article on MSDN right now that mentions that. Also, ASP.NET Core 2.0 has been released, and the Framework Core 2.0 and .NET Standard 2.0 has been released. And here's the part about it that I think is interesting is a lot of people have never even heard of .NET Standard, and that's a shame because it's major. This thing has over 32,000 APIs to where what they've tried to do is they've tried to create like this wrapper, this abstraction around .NET Core and various other pieces so that instead of coding directly to .NET Core, you can code to this .NET Standard and it will go across platforms a little bit better. So they've kind of abstracted this thing away so that you're not always stuck working at one level or so deep. You can come up and then it'll go across Windows Mobile, it'll go across ASP.NET, it'll go across Windows Desktop, Windows Desktop. So .NET Standard to me is actually like, it's one of those hidden gems that a lot of people don't know about. So anyways, definitely check this out. But there was one key piece of information that I saw in the article that is super exciting because this was not the case previously. Like if you were coding in .NET Standard, it had to support the various different things. Now what they said is you can reference the .NET Framework libraries from .NET Standard libraries using Visual Studio 2017 15.3. This feature will help you migrate your .NET Framework code to .NET Standard or .NET Core over time. That's killer because before, if it wasn't implemented in the .NET Core or whatever you were targeting, you were just kind of out of luck. Like you couldn't even use the .NET Standard thing to wrap it. But now it sounds like you can bring those DLLs along and it'll play nicely with them. So that's a huge step, at least from what I'm reading here. That's a huge step, and you can start coding to .NET Standard, which will get you in a position where you can actually start porting across different platforms a little bit better. So, in a more standardized, abstracted way, which is pretty awesome. So, pretty exciting stuff. I need to read into it a little bit more, but again, the link's here, so you guys can all check that out. And then the last little bit of news that we have here, and hopefully this will be out before the 21st, man. The solar eclipse is coming up.
Oh, that's right.
Is that why you had that there?
I didn't want you guys to know what I was talking about, right? That is the total solar eclipse is happening this coming Monday, the 21st. So, hopefully you've gotten your glasses. If you haven't, man, good luck.
Well, this is only a total solar eclipse for people in a very specific region of the country.
Well, no, it's all across the country, but in a very specific band across the country, right? So there's I'll find a link to this site that I found where somebody, a programmer, had written an API for Google Maps that shows the band coming across, and you can search for a spot on there, and it'll show you if you're in the totality zone or not. So it was a good use of the API. Really cool stuff. So at any rate, hopefully you got your glasses. If you hadn't, like me, then you probably just paid way too much for a bunch of paper glasses that are going to be shipping my way, hopefully, this week. So that is it for the news.
All right, well, let's get into the meat of our topic tonight, which is all about anti-patterns and some of the big ones that we might face. So we're going to start with abstraction inversion. So I'm going to say the quote simple definition that they have here. This is taken from Wikipedia, and it says, not exposing implemented functionality required by callers of a function, method, or constructor so that the calling code awkwardly re-implements the same functionality in terms of those calls.
What?
That's clear as mud, right?
In English, please.
Yeah, so that was, unfortunate. But what I've eventually distilled from this after reading on some other places that basically what I previously said was a complicated way of just saying you try to implement what should be a simple concept and you build it on top of complex concepts rather than the other way around. Right?
So you're saying that the abstractions are actually making things less clear than easier?
So here's an example that can illustrate this really good. Let's say I ask you to implement two functions. The first function needs to print out text to the console. And then the second one needs to print out formatted text to the console. Okay. Now, typically what you would think is, okay, well, let me write my first method that just prints out whatever it's given and put it out to the console. And then the formatted version is going to do whatever formatting is necessary and then call the other one, right? But in this case, picture you did the inverse and you write the formatted version first, and then you call what should be the simple, the less complex version, i.e. the no formatting version. You write it so that it calls the printed version just with no formatting specification. Does that make sense?
So you're saying that you called the more complex one from the simple one instead of the other way around?
In that particular example.
Okay.
I don't think I got that one. So we're saying there's two. There's like a pretty print, like a formatted one, and then there's like a kind of a normal one. And we're saying rather than calling the pretty print on top of the normal, we're having the normal one call the pretty print.
Yes.
But you said in that particular example, so well, how would that change? Maybe you have another example?
Yes. So there are definitely more examples. There was another one that was more physical, but another author was like, he disagreed with it, but it kind of does illustrate the point. But let's just say that this example is in question. Whereas like, you would use a battery to make electronic equipment, but to use electronic equipment to create a battery would be weird.
That seems like a circular reference. As opposed to, no, that one doesn't illustrate it for me as well.
Yeah, well, like I said, that one was in question, and I've got a link to an article here. But another example that maybe this one will make more sense to you. I wasn't as crazy about this one, and this is specific to Java. But they said like using a vector in Java to implement a fixed size list instead of an array would be an example of the abstraction inversion because the vector is using an array internally.
That makes more sense to me. Okay. So you're kind of doing things backwards is what it's saying.
Well, now here was my favorite example though.
Okay.
And I think we've talked about markup languages, storing things in markup languages before, right? I know we've definitely had this conversation in professional environments, but the idea here is you serialize your object to XML, then you read it in. Now you have a DOM, right? So you now have program data, right? Which is the DOM representing the markup, which is the XML, representing the program data, which is the original object to begin with.
Okay.
Do you understand?
I think I do. It hurts my head. But basically what you're saying is you're using the more complex objects to now build the simpler objects that they're sort of based off of. Is really what it sounds like, right? Like, yeah, I think that's what I'm getting.
I think
the
you
abstraction
said that
inversion.
backwards.
Well, like in the vector thing, right? Like a vector is a more full-featured version of an array, or not full-featured, but it's a two-way type thing. I think a vector is, but it can grow, right? That's the difference versus the fixed size array. So if I remember right, and it's been a while since I messed with Java, but like you said, the vector is based off the array because it can grow. So it's almost like a resizing array, right? So the more complicated thing now, they're trying to force it to create the simpler version of itself.
Okay, think about it this way. This is my takeaway from this, is that normally you would build these simple little building blocks, right? And you're going to piece those building blocks to create a more complicated thing, correct? So if we were to talk about a physical structure, right, we're going to lay down a slab. That's going to be the simple thing. And then we're going to have thousands of these little bitty bricks that each one are rather simple, but we're going to piece them together and create a complicated wall and a series of walls, right? And we're going to keep adding on until eventually we're going to have a roof and a whole structure, right? So we took individually all these simple little things to create one big complex thing. Mm-hmm. Flip that on its head. And that's the abstraction inversion.
one huge complex
You're
thing to build a
creating-
simple thing.
You're using you're trying to create something simple, and in order to create that something simple, you're using all the complex stuff.
Okay, that makes sense.
So instead of using the brick to build a house, you're using a house to build a brick.
Yep. Which is why the vector thing is crazy. It's way more complicated, and now it's creating this little tiny array type deal. Okay, that makes sense.
It's a weird one.
Yeah.
I'll give you that.
Yeah, I kind of wondering, it's like, how do I know if I'm going down this path? Like, is there like some sort of signal or something that I can use to help me realize when I'm doing this?
If you show up on Wikipedia as a subnote on this particular page.
Is that we finally found a real world example?
Yeah, I'm sure this episode will be listed in the Wikipedia article for it.
Right.
As,
That's a good idea.
The abstraction inversion. Listen to how they made the explanation more complicated than the reality.
Yeah, I don't know that there's. I don't know that
Also
there's,
known as coding bloxing.
right coding bloxing. That's awesome. Yeah, I don't know that there'd be anything other than just intuition, right? Like you look at it, you're like, wait a second, why are you using this factory of factories to create this little factory? I don't know.
I've kind of got this weird image of like a robot or a person or something with like all their organs like on the outside, and you feel to like interact with them by like squeezing the heart and then moving the hand to where you want it, rather than just being able to say like, "Hey, robot, go do a thing."
Man,
So you're very much in control of like their internals. But I don't know, maybe that's just weird.
Yeah, that's a little.
It's
bizarre.
weird and irrelevant.
A little bizarre.
Well, that makes for a
Moving
nice
along.
segue.
Yeah. So I promise you that the others aren't this weird. At least the other ones I've researched. But this, I had a real tough time with mine. I just didn't like it. I don't really get it. I feel like it's heavily based on stuff that I don't know about, and that makes me instantly disrespect it. But I never heard of this before, so it must be crap. But it was the one I looked into was called Ambiguity Viewpoint, which is presenting a model which is heavily based on like object-oriented analysis and design without specifying its viewpoint.
Yeah, please do explain.
All right. So first, let's start with what a viewpoint is. So in the every example I looked at, they were all kind of crappy. Please, if you've got a good example I can look at, or a good explanation I can read, or something, I'd love to see it. But everyone I found looks like they basically copy and pasted the same text from the same source, like back in 1970, and nobody gets it. And they all just kind of paste the same one example and then move on to the next one. But
they
the three
assume you know it.
viewpoints.
Do you even viewpoint, bro?
exactly. And then no one knows what a viewpoint is. But there were three viewpoints. I felt like this made a little bit of sense after talking about domain-driven design so much. The first was the business viewpoint. So we've got problems that we're solving from the view of like a customer. This is coming from the view of our problem domain. So like your customer service agent, or if you've got like an add to cart method or something like that that's expressed in terms of the domain and the language that's used to model your actual business process, then that's one viewpoint. The next was the specification viewpoint, parentheses system. And that's more of, we're not quite getting into code land yet, so if add to cart was a business viewpoint, a specification viewpoint would be more like the website. This is the applications, the big higher level systems, maybe we're talking about databases and middle tiers that are involved in making those kinds of things work. And then the third viewpoint is implementation. This is where we're talking about software and design. This is where, we get my cart bean from the user bean, and we, do something on it and add some items to our cart objects. So we're really talking about three different kind of levels of abstraction, which we're calling viewpoints for some reason. And we're talking about kind of mixing those. And the best I can come up with from the reading I did is that if we had an object that kind of shotgunned all over all three of these kind of layers. So we have a method, I don't even know how you have a method that really involves like something at the system level, but you just have things in this class or these methods that kind of talk to all three layers. So we're not keeping our levels of abstraction consistent. So you can imagine like having a method add to cart that takes in a customer object, great. But instead of a product, maybe it takes in a database connection string and a query. And then at the final level, I don't know, like a like a bit mask,
or maybe it's writing something to disk as well, like it's trying to get an access to a thread on a file system or something. Maybe.
Yeah. So you can imagine a class where you've got all these three things going on. So in order to do any sort of work with this guy, you have to know about the business domain. So you have to understand the rules. You have to know about the various systems in play and what that means. And then you also need to know about really low level details, like on how these things actually interop.
Okay. That sort of makes sense then. So what they're saying then is this ambiguous viewpoint is when you mix different abstraction layers together. And so it becomes really hard to manage that stuff or really even understand what it's supposed to be doing in the first place, right?
Yeah, you're like, I want to add to cart. Like, why am I talking about what level of SQL server we're using? It's just we're kind of mixing the modes of operation. But I think I'm reading a lot more into that than I read in the various slideshows and the 3 little bullet points that I saw in the place. So I wasn't real happy with that kind of understanding. That's just kind of what I got to after reading about it. But I think it does kind of align fairly well with just the idea that we're kind of dealing with something from different levels of abstraction. We've mixed our high and our low together.
Okay, I think I follow.
All right, good.
To be clear,
don't.
These are anti-patterns.
Yeah. It's like, that sounds kind of cool.
All right.
The singularity.
Anything for you, Outlaw?
No, I'm thoroughly confused. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right, moving on. I think this one, all right, so this is the first one that I think maybe we can all feel good about because I think this one's pretty clear. So, ironically enough, it's called the Big Ball of Mud. So, it's clear as mud, and this is basically a system with no recognizable structure. And we've all worked in these. As a matter of fact, if you haven't, you're probably not far enough along in your career to understand that these are real. So basically, a software system, a ball of mud software system is one that lacks any type of perceivable architecture. And this is interesting. The way that it was stated was this is due to code entropy. And basically, the rule of entropy, I forget, it has something to do with thermo something.
Never destroyed or created?
Yeah, basically.
Or no, all become more complex or like kind of fall apart.
That's exactly
less organized over
Nothing
time.
goes away. It just gets more complex. So basically what the whole thing is your complexity grows in the system as modifications are made, unless you try really hard not to do it. And that's really the key here. And that's kind of how software, and it's funny, the nice way of putting this is organically grows, right? Because that makes it sound not so bad. If it's organic, it's got to be sort of good,
Right? It's agile.
Exactly. So here's the thing. This is where the term spaghetti code typically comes from. And I love the way that he stated this. And there was something that was referenced in the Wikipedia where they say that this typically happens due to unregulated growth and repeated expedient repair. So basically, get it done now. You got to get it done now. Got to get it done now. And this is typically what happens, right? Because you're always fighting the clock and you're always trying to get things done as quick as possible. And that's how your code ends up in the state that it is. They also say it's typically developed over a long period of time with multiple developers, or you have a group of developers working on small parts of the problem incrementally over time, rather than before you get started on little bits and pieces of it, understanding the overall problem. So as you're moving along, someone will be like, oh, well, that's not right. And then you make a hack, and then, oh, well, we need to do this. You make another hack, right? And so you just keep repeating that until the complexity grows and you kind of got this mess left to maintain.
Okay. So how do I know if I'm going down this path? Like, I know it after the fact. I can easily see, the problems, but when I'm in the moment.
No, I think it's easy to see in the moment, right? Like if you copy and paste a piece of code instead of thinking about how is this shared, that's almost the first step, right? Like if you copy and paste an entire chunk of code,
But this doesn't necessarily have to be about copy and paste.
No, I'm just saying he said, how do you know that you're starting down this path, right? Like that's one. Another is, you're working along like this incremental thing. You're working along, and then all of a sudden, oh, we need to do this. And it's structurally very different than what had been designed up to that point. And instead of actually stepping back and saying, okay, how can I make this thing work properly? You put a Band-Aid on it, right? You've now gone down that path. You've now said, oh, I think that we can force it in by doing this, right? Or we can trick it by doing this. As soon as you start making those shortcuts decisions, you've pretty much started down that road. And it happens, right? Like it totally happens. Hey, we got to ship this product tomorrow, but we found this thing that's a problem, but it just straight up doesn't fit in the overall architecture. And then you're like, well, I can make it work, right?
Mm-hmm. It feels like every program or every software project will eventually become a big ball of mud without continued refactoring and cleanup. Like to Joe's question, I don't think you can know it in the moment, right? Until you've already gotten to that point. And you got to that point because you weren't cleaning up as you went. So maybe that's how you know. Is if you're never paying off any of your technical debt, if you're never cleaning up anything, then that's when you know, like, oh, well, we're building a big ball of mud, and maybe we don't recognize it yet, but we eventually will.
Yeah, you may not see it the minute that you're doing it, but as soon as you get some sort of task where it's like, hey, you need to go change this, and what should have been a 10-minute deal turned into a 2-hour deal, you've been down that path, right? And unfortunately, that does happen a lot, right? And in order for it not to happen, you have to have the buy-in of upper management to understand that, hey, if we take these short-term hacks and we keep going down this road, then in the future, it's going to be very time-consuming to do much of anything, right? And to do it in a way that's not going to be dangerous to the overall outcome of what you're doing. And you've got to somehow sell it to upper management that, hey, if you'll give us the time to do this now, we can build a more stable system that we can expand upon further in the future quicker. We can iterate faster if we take the time now, but that's a lot of times hard to do because the whole purpose is companies are there to make money. And so it's a constant trade-off and it's difficult. And here's the part. Why do they exist? Because they work initially, right? You can keep iterating on something extremely fast. You can keep plowing away at it and it's working, but there's going to be some sort of inflection point to where the time that it takes to make small changes or even fix things becomes so difficult and so time consuming and so brittle that you've probably crossed a bridge, right? And now it needs to start thinking about redesign or trying to work towards a better state.
So maybe an example would be you create a permission system, right? And initially your permission system, you're thinking, okay, well, I'll have a set of users and a set of columns on each user record in my table, right, that represent what permissions they'll have. And, you might only have a few basic permissions in the beginning, right? And that works initially, what you're describing. And then you want to evolve it into, over time, you keep adding permissions until eventually this thing grows into, well, now to add in one additional permission, you have to touch 30 different places, right? That's the type of thing that you're talking about where
yes.
You just kept adding on to it. It worked initially because it was a small set and it was a small, very specialized kind of situation. But then as that thing grew and evolved into something big and, your permissions got granular, without refactoring it into something that could handle that situation, it became a nightmare to maintain.
Right. And now it's brittle, right? Every time you touch it, you might forget file number 23 or whatever. So yeah, that's one. Another one that I can think of that that we see, and we've all seen in our career, is we've talked about it. Database first kind of sort of is a lot of the time what people look at. And I know the structure and I know how the data needs to live, and now let's build an app around it. When you start accessing code using like queries all throughout your code base, there's no structure now. It's just willy-nilly access to the database, right? Hey, go get some data from here and let's cram it out here and put it in the UI. And let's get data from the UI and throw it into the database. And instead of having like a centralized area where things go access that, now refactoring becomes a major pain because if you change a column in a table, instead of there being one place that you may need to go change, you might have 50 places in your app that are all using that, and they might be aliasing it differently or whatever. So things like that are definitely notions where, when you start seeing the same code in multiple different places, I think that's when you know that you've sort of gone down the wrong path.
By the way, Joe loves aliases. Just if you ever want to have a fun conversation, hit Joe up on Slack. And if you haven't already joined up on Slack so that you could have that conversation with Joe, you should head to www.codingblocks.net/Slack and learn how to join.
Yes, indeed.
And then ask Joe all about table aliases.
Yeah, I'll let you know. There's certain things I love to get on my soapbox about, and that's one of them. I have a couple other kind of warning signs that maybe you could kind of watch out for. And I'm not sure if these are legit or not. This is just kind of things I was thinking about while we're talking about it. But if you find yourself Control F programming, that's where you like find one variable that has like a unique looking name and copy and paste it, search for it to see everywhere else that it's called in the code base. And then you go and kind of like tack on, your new section that to kind of model after that.
Yep.
Adding null checks. This is what I'm really bad about, and also kind of being safe. Like if I don't understand how something works, but I know there's a bug there, I might be tempted to just kind of add the null check to just ignore that thing because it doesn't really matter in whatever case I'm looking at. Like, oh, the user is null here for some reason, and I'm trying to do something on a user, so let me just add a null check and just not do that if there's no user, no big deal. But what I'm really saying there is that there's a business process here that's now become misaligned with my code, right? And I don't have the time or the understanding or the ability to kind of iron that out. And so I'm just going to make a little loophole here and call it done.
So that you don't get the null argument exception or null object reference or whatever.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Or, like it's happens a lot with like copy paste stuff. You copy paste stuff from one area to another. It doesn't quite work because there's this rule and that rule. And so you just kind of delete those parts or tweak them in order to kind of make them not yell. But, you really got to wonder why you're doing that. But then again, you're worried about time. You're worried about breaking changes because this stuff is hard to work on. And I started thinking about that. It's like, well, why am I trying to program safely? Because I think this is I'm a big offender here.
So is the Joe anti-pattern? Is that what we're saying?
This is one I'm very guilty of. I'm a spaghetti maker.
Oh, that really was.
Yeah, I really don't want that to catch on.
Wow. Okay, I take that back. This is the Zap. Zap anti-pattern. How about that? Oops.
There might be some editing to do.
No editing. It was a pure accident.
Some sensitivity training here pretty soon.
Dang it! I apologize.
Oh boy.
Jeez.
Another thing I kind of thought of is like if you think that writing unit tests would be difficult in your code base, then you've probably got a big ball of mud.
Yeah.
So we agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. If there's no slices or no patterns or no kind of, you can't look at it and say, hey, this is separated from this, then you got a big ball of mud, right? Like if everything's just literally all jumbled together and you're like, yeah, I can't touch any of this because it's going to break everything on the other end, right? Like it's not just going to break it from here to here. It's going to break it from here all the way down over there and then back up there. That's what we're talking about. You mentioned those ad hoc queries. That's what kind of got me thinking about it. It's like if you're able to just kind of reach from here to anywhere to grab whatever you need in the moment rather than having like an organized flow, that makes testing difficult. And it's also literally, kind of what you think about when you think about like spaghetti and meatballs all kind of jammed together. Yep.
Yeah, I'm thinking like if you have methods that are hundreds or thousands of lines long, then you're in that category.
Yep, definitely. Switch case
maybe
statements.
even classes.
Yeah, possibly, right? Those could use refactoring. It depends on what it is, but yeah, I mean anything
it's
that's
probably
crazy
a class
long.
is trying to do too much, right? Like that was another one. We weren't going to get to it tonight, but the God object.
Yep.
So that's probably a class that is a God object.
Yes.
So let's move on to databases as IPC. So this one's kind of simple. The definition they have here is using a database. A database is used as the message queue for routine interprocess communication in a situation where a lightweight IPC mechanism such as sockets would be more suitable. So, I mean, this is just what you think it would be. It'd be a slow and inefficient way of, trying to tell something else like, oh, you should probably go and process this job or do this thing, right? You write something out to some table, and then you're assuming that something else is watching that in a timely fashion, and then it's going to kick off some job. So it's popular because databases are way more widely understood than the alternatives.
Yeah, this reminds me of like chat apps, right? Like where if you're just going to write a chat app, it'd be really easy to say, okay, I'm going to have a messaging table and you're going to write to that message and then you're going to send that message across, right? Like as opposed to, hey, just connect these two sockets and let the message go across a wire. Why do you need this intermediate write? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that one's, I can totally see why it's done because you're right. It's easy. You understand it. Okay, I'm going to write to the database. I'm going to query the database and just constantly do that as opposed to, all right, open this socket over here and let's run this. So yeah, cool stuff.
Yeah, I don't know though. I kind of like having not necessarily a database, but some sort of queue involved in case, like, say, that message doesn't go through. Like if, like I know Skype will very quickly email you if you go offline and somebody sends you a message, and I like that. I want that, right? So I'm glad it's not a direct connection. I don't want to lose messages if I lose internet. It's pretty rare, and maybe if I'm streaming, it's pretty rare, I think, to have messages that I don't care if they get through or not.
Well,
but wouldn't a queue be an interprocess communication form?
It is, I think. And that's, it could be. I think the key is here, this is databases IPC, right? So if you're using something like a queue, then you're probably using the correct mechanism, right?
Okay.
That's the way I interpreted it.
Yeah.
So if you're polling, if your code is ever polling something, then there's a chance that, you are doing this. Or if you're pulling a database.
A database, yeah, there you go.
Database.
Yeah. Specifically, because people know how to do insert and select from.
It's so easy.
It really is. It's easy to abuse.
And then if you're it's a double win if you include that SQL directly in your code, right? Without a repository or anything.
Oh, stop it!
Intermediary.
It hurts.
Well, how else are you going to? You got to create your big ball of mud somewhere. You got to start somehow, Alan.
Maybe you could just have layers of mud, right? Like you have some nice clean abstractions, but then you have a layer of mud, and then you have some more abstract. It'd be like a mud pie or something, right? So,
what about like flavored mud of the week, where it's like 1 week I'm reading about functional programming, I'm all excited about that. So you see a bunch of like static classes. And then I start reading domain-driven design.
Yeah, it definitely happens.
Yeah. Well, and I got these aggregate roots all over the place.
But that's some sort of architecture. That's just balls of architecture all over the place.
Well, your layers of mud, I thought you were going to go down the lasagna path.
I haven't, because I think we're going to be talking about that shortly.
Not tonight. But yeah, that was another one, lasagna code.
Cool.
All right, next one up is gold plating, which is continuing to work on a task or project well past the point at which extra effort is no longer adding value. And my first thought was like, who the heck has this problem? Am I right?
Wait, open source projects maybe?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I could see that.
No, come on. You've never like just refactored something beyond the point where you're like, okay, I really want to clean this up one more time. There's one more thing I want to do here, but is there any value to it? No.
Rarely.
I don't think I've ever
There's been times.
Alan wrote it right the first time.
I definitely worked for a large company once where like had like little sub teams, and sometimes like sub teams would kind of push off changes. They would like refuse any kind of like, or fight really hard to like push off business requirement changes, but they would kind of like iterate on their own little corner or their own little module, like, and just make it kind of super tight. But everyone kind of hated them, and I think it was pretty rare.
Don't be that group.
I could definitely see to where if you left a developer alone to just say, hey, go work on this, I could totally see where this would happen, right? Because you're going to be like, oh man, this is almost 100% perfect. And so you're going to keep doing that. But I think
that's kind of what I was thinking about. Like, this feels like an easy trap to get into when you start thinking about like the non-functionals.
Yes.
Like if you start, yeah, you have it. It's perfectly functional, but you keep like trying to clean it up and refactoring it, and it's all non-functional kind of thing that you're thinking about. You could get into gold plating, which I love.
Has that
this
ever
name,
happened in work? Like, has there ever been a situation in a professional environment where you got all sorts of time to spend, all the time you wanted to spend on non-functionals? And so like your logging framework is great. You know, you've got your 12-factor app, like everything is like brilliant and amazing. And, we'll get to the features later. We're going to just keep working on infrastructure. Like, man, like they're going to get a new manager in there and he is going to kick your butt.
I'm not thinking about like maybe the app as a whole, but like maybe classes within an app or like packages that are delivered separately that, the overall app might use. But like, that's where I'm thinking of the gold plating could come in, where you're like, just overdoing the cleanup on something. Yeah, maybe more than you should.
You own this little portion of the app, and you're like, "This is going to be perfect."
And it is beautiful. it really is.
Okay, so I'm imagining like there's like a team meeting, right? And everyone's talking about their problems. They're going through the Scrum, and then one team member gets up, and they're like, "Okay, here's our documentation. We can't decide." Arial or Helvetica for the docs. What do you think?
Well, it's always Arial. There's no question.
I feel like any place I've ever worked, they'd be run out of town on a rail.
Right. Like everybody's standing there with red bloodshot eyes because they've been working on feature X for God knows how long. And this dude's like, totally, man. I don't know which font.
Yeah.
I
can't decide if I like this more if it's 5 pixels to the left or if it's just 3.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think that this definitely could happen, right? Like if somebody was just given all the time in the world to where, they got to work on their little pet project, I can totally see this happening.
I've seen projects.
I know. I totally feel like I'm guilty of this on the micro level.
I think you could, but that's got, yes, I think you could. I don't know that I could. I get too bored with the problem. But I think it's a certain type of person. But the problem is, like, I think you could, but you'd never be allowed to because you make yourself too important to the team on big features, right? Like in places where you work. And I think that's the thing, right? Like if you ever get to the point where this is what you can do, then you might be a little bit worried, maybe, because
I have like specific examples in mind where it's like, I just kept refactoring something. I was like, oh, I should write a test that can handle this situation. Oh, but look, that's not exposed. I need to clean this up. I need to refactor this so I can test that. Oh, let me write 5 more tests to go after that. Oh, you know what else I could test? And then like I started falling into this like test rabbit hole. So like in the end, I feel like it does make the thing in this particular example that I'm thinking of, maybe more robust and solid and tested. But from the functionality point of view, I passed that a long time ago, and everything else I was doing was just gold plating onto what was already functional. Like it already got the job done, and I just kept gold plating it.
Outlaw, the only person who has ever gotten greater than 100% test coverage.
Come on, you guys know you've done this. I'm not the only one here.
No, I do.
Do you really?
Well, so side projects, like there's a million side projects I've started, and I would not gold plate the whole project, never, but like one little feature,
yes,
where I'm like, I'm working on, say I'm making a website, and for some reason, even though 100% of my users only ever see the front end web page, I'm spending 90% of my time in admin,
right?
Where there just isn't as much value.
Is a thing of beauty,
right?
And I've worked with project managers too that would have their kind of like their own things that they just thought were really important and the customer just didn't really care. But for some reason they kept coming back and talking to you about like autocomplete or something else that just really wasn't that important. But I guess that's kind of an example of gold plating, but I just kind of thought of it as like almost being like the whole project. And I thought about like maybe, Blizzard video games, like they kind of have a long history of like delaying releases by years, multiple years in order to kind of keep polishing. But then, I mean, there's always still bug fixes, years later. So
Yeah, there's a difference between polish and just adding unnecessary things, right? That's
I can't help but think that, like, as he brought up the Blizzard example, I'm like, oh, well, I guess Activision is really guilty of gold plating Call of Duty all these years.
yeah, no kidding.
man. That was interesting.
Oh, I can't hate on Call of Duty though.
Man, I haven't played it in 2 years. All right, so the next one I have, this one was kind of interesting too. I didn't get stuck with any that were just completely odd, I don't guess. So this is called the inter-platform effect, and I thought it was weird initially. A system so customizable as to become a poor replica of the software development platform. So really what they're saying is typically like software will end up growing into this big thing that already the underlying platform does. So they called out something like FileZilla, right? The Mozilla FTP client that was created at one point to be an FTP client, and really what they ended up doing was duplicating what the OS could already do. So like Windows already had FTP built in. Now granted, they probably did it in some ways better or more efficiently or whatever, but that was what they were talking about. And a lot of times in this case, it wouldn't be as efficient. And so here was an example, and I thought this was ironic because one of our more popular posts on our site has to do with this very topic, which is entity attribute value tables in SQL Server. And it's a big problem for e-commerce because you start, especially when you talk about relational database systems, is how do you store all these properties? Do you keep adding, to what you said earlier? Do you just keep adding fields to a table? If you have product A, you could just keep adding more items to it. Well, that becomes hard to maintain. So this whole entity attribute value thing is you have an entity ID, you have an attribute, and then you have a value. So like maybe the color and then the value's pink, right? And then you have another one like weight and 3 pounds. And instead of it being a real table, it's just a bunch of these attributes listed out in row format. And the problem with this is it takes away from the strength of the database. Now to query that and get any kind of real view of the product, you're going to have to do some pivoting or some unioning or whatever. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the only way to really use it is to have an application sitting on top of it. So this was an example of they're trying to redo something differently than what the underlying system already does well for you. So now granted, typically when you're doing an EAV, the reason you're doing it is to address the problem of an admin or other things. It's a different portion of it, but it goes counter to what the underlying system is supposed to be doing for you. Another one that was pretty interesting was overly generic schemas in like XML or JSON. So, instead of having a person with a first name and a last name, you might just have object, name, value, and you try and reuse this thing, and there might be a type on it called person, but it's the same type thing. You're just trying to make everything overly generic so you can work with it all. But in the end, it becomes incredibly cumbersome to work with because you made it too generic, right? Like you took away the meaning from it to make it something that you could basically loop in your application. So really, that's what they're talking about here. Now, they also do point out there are cases where they've done these things properly, and it's done properly when the system becomes portable. So in the instance of Java, right? Like you have this cross-platform inner system that runs on the OS, but you can put it on Windows, you can put it on Mac, you can put it on Linux, whatever. I would argue now that even .NET Core is one of those same type features where they made this inner system that's now portable, and Docker to a certain degree. They're getting to the point to where they can do that stuff cross-platform. So it's interesting. It can be a negative if you're recreating something that the OS already does better for you. Then it's arguable that maybe you shouldn't even gone down that path in the first place.
Yeah, I think about how many applications I built that were basically just Dropbox and Excel, and by the time you get around to like letting them create their own custom tables, like definitely in Salesforce too, like you can create your own objects, and if you build an interface to allow them to do that, then at some level you are kind of recreating this simple tool that's already available and doing a worse job of it.
I can't believe you didn't mention this example they had here, though. This is my favorite one, where we've all seen these before, where it's like Windows 3.1 or Windows 95 that somebody recreated in HTML and JavaScript and CSS, right? So you have the entire, this whole desktop within your browser, which is running on your desktop.
In your browser.
So, yeah. So it's like, Inception.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it makes sense, right? Like that's, I don't know, the whole thing's odd. I don't know that I've ever fully duplicated it, but we've all created things like you said, your own Dropbox type thing, right? Like you've created this file upload thing that you can go download from and all that, and inevitably we've all probably done a little bit of this.
I'm trying to think. I'm sure I have. I just can't think. These giant examples keep coming to mind, though, and I'm like, I definitely haven't written a browser desktop.
So
within
maybe
a browser.
Yeah, maybe not giant ones, but like you said, the Dropbox thing. We've all written applications to where you had an upload button, and it would upload a file, and then somewhere else you'd have some sort of component that would show you a list of the files that you have access to, and then you'd be like, oh well, only certain people need to be able to see this, and then you start writing like permission level type stuff on top of it, and it's like, wait a second, the OS already does this garbage, right? So it's definitely interesting, like. We've done it in smaller forms, but we've all probably done it to a certain degree.
I know. Like a lot of times when I try to write games, I'll end up like starting to write a board game, and like if 2 hours into it, I'm like, okay, I'm writing a board game engine that will be reusable across all the games going forward for the rest of my life. And 4 hours into that, I'm like realize I'm like totally just putting a really crappy interface on top of whatever engine I've already got. I'm like, why am I doing this?
You're gold plating it.
Yeah, and then I stop for the day.
And then I need to make it scale to 1,000 concurrent players.
Yeah.
Oh no, that's if Alan was
That's
doing
my job. Not 1,000, man. All the players.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Babillion.
Babillions.
All right. So let's get into the next one, which is input kludge. So this is simple user input that is not handled. So we've all been there, and we all do our best. We try to properly verify and sanitize our user input, and we write tests for it. But inevitably, as soon as it goes out for testing, someone comes back and they're like, "Oh yeah, no, it doesn't work. If I type this in, it blows up, or if I enter this in, it blows up, or out in the field, some random user enters something. You're like, oh, why didn't I think of that?" So it's difficult for us as the developer to write unit tests to cover these scenarios, but yet somehow it's easy for the users, or at least we perceive it's easy for them because they come back so quickly with like, oh yeah, no, it doesn't work if I do this. It just totally blows up.
But wait a second. How is this an anti-pattern? I feel like this is like not an anti-pattern.
This is just the way of things.
Yeah. Like seriously. I need a definition as to why this is an anti-pattern, because I feel like this is the way of the world.
I mean, I did. Why are you arguing with me? I didn't. This is one. This is one of them, Alan. Just accept it.
Does nobody else look at this and go, that's not an anti-pattern. That's just what it is.
In fairness, it's also listed as a software bug, which I definitely agree is where it's more heavy on. But I don't know why the anti-pattern. It's there, man. Why are you hating?
I see in the Wikipedia it mentions failing to specify and implement. So you've got to ideally, I guess we would specify what we accept and what we don't, and then stick to it.
Man, I still don't like that.
Yeah, I tell you, whoever wrote this has never worked with importing spreadsheets, because you will find the wackiest stuff. It's like, how did you get a null column? Like, how did you get a null at the end of a string? How did you get a new line there somehow? Like, why is there a column off in space that no one's ever, why does that have a space in it now that's like over on like column, A52 or whatever?
These are real, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the examples that they give here is that, which I kind of felt like, okay, I wonder if this is like the canonical reference for this thing, right? Which was like the buffer overflow is a common example of this anti-pattern that Alan doesn't agree with. It's a software bug.
It's a problem, is what it is. It's not an anti-pattern. This is a problem.
Well, but okay. So bugs are a good pattern or an anti-pattern?
They're not a pattern. Those are bugs.
I'm just making the case for input kludge being an anti-pattern.
If you are creating a pattern of bugs, then that's just another problem, right? But that's not a pattern, or there shouldn't be a pattern to your bugs.
It's definitely not a good pattern.
I feel like this is different. This is just software nightmares. Is what this is.
Well, so is a big ball of mud.
No, but that's an anti-pattern. There is no pattern. This is just...
This is a bad pattern.
It's weird, right? And the reason I guess why I'm like, how is this an anti-pattern is this is very platform or UI specific, right? If your UI tools don't give you the ability, HTML is a perfect example of where this is just stupid. You have all these input fields and there's no built-in way in HTML to validate anything, right? There's nothing on a field that says this can only be a big integer, right? There's nothing that you can put on there. Yeah, you can totally tack on JavaScript frameworks, or you can even do some other things around it. But you have all these fields, but you can't validate them. And I feel like that's why this seems like just this isn't fair. Like I don't know. I feel like it's wrong.
I think Alan has become a PHP developer overnight, and he's just upset about all the SQL injection that he's getting hit with in his forms. So they listed some ways to test this thing, which I found kind of humorous. So the first one they said was just mashing on the keyboard, but then they were like, well, that lacks reproducibility. But it was one of the ways that they mentioned here, which... And this is the part where it was kind of humorous to me because these all felt like it was the same thing being said over. But another one that they listed was monkey testing, which, again, you might think, well, what is monkey testing? Well, imagine if you handed the keyboard to a monkey. The monkey's just going to bang on the keyboard. Well, how's that different than mashing on a keyboard? And then
I'll tell you though, monkeys have nothing on the users I'm used to dealing with. Like a monkey, you'd have to do some funky stuff to get some new lines hidden up in a username field in such a way that you can't tell by looking at the spreadsheet. Well, that involves some creative resizing of the cells to hide that crap.
Well, the monkey, in all fairness, wasn't able to copy and paste from an Excel sheet into that, right? That's the big problem is your users are like, I got this spreadsheet over here, copy paste, right? I've got this web page, copy paste.
Yeah, and this is where the last one that they mentioned was fuzz testing, which is kind of like the monkey testing, except, because there's the difference with fuzz testing is you're talking about providing invalid or unexpected input, but then there's this other one where it's random data, which is what the whole mashing on the keyboard and the monkey testing is all about, just randomness, right? And so in that regard, that's why I'm kind of throwing fuzz testing into the same category with the other two.
You know what? I just had a good idea for a piece of software. What if you just literally had something that could randomly generate input, like known bad inputs, things that cause headaches all over the place? Look, you're both searching to see if it exists, aren't you?
I thought
it definitely exists.
PHP.
You think so? But no, if you had some sort of API that people could call that just gave them crap in to see if it broke their stuff, that would be, I think it would get used. So
yeah, Burp Suite I know is the one that I kind of messed around with a little bit. That's just a free one, and that's just one of the options. You can configure it to go to web pages and stuff. It's got all sorts of tools for navigating web pages and web apps and stuff. And you can actually just kind of check the fuzz, and you can even set the parameters and regexes, all sorts of stuff on it, and it will literally try to plug in every drop. If you have a drop down, you can configure it so it doesn't just select some item; it just passes whatever random crap in that drop down. And a lot of times, code will say you'll have a combo box or a drop down, whatever, and it'll have the value, and it may not necessarily be a number. And you can put SQL injection stuff kind of in there, and people don't really think about it because you're, not really pass. You're expecting that number all the time because that's what you set out, but it doesn't mean that that's what you're getting back from the client. So fuzzers like that are like really popular in security tools.
Yeah, I was going to say Burp Suite is actually an injection tool, right? Like a penetration tool. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then I think we've talked about this too, but like Firebase as an example, if you're doing Android development, in Firebase, there's the UI application exerciser monkey where it just bangs on your app, just random inputs, random clicks, random touches, whatever, throughout your app. So there's definitely some tools out there.
We should totally list that. Wait, did they
Burp Suite is $350 a year if you buy it. I think there's a free version though.
Yeah. So Firebase is Google? I didn't
Yes.
realize that. Oh, man. My battery died on my mouse. What's that about? There we go. All right, cool. I'm going to put Firebase in the notes here because I think that's useful.
Unacceptable. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, here we go.
Well, here, I've already got a link here.
Oh, I put it. It's there. It's done.
Dang it.
Yeah, man. Too fast. All right, Joe.
All right. So, first of all, input. Can I get some eyes? Say I if you think input kludge is a anti-pattern, or if it's just a problem.
It's a kludge.
I.
What?
Right.
It's a problem or what?
Anti-pattern.
Well, he said the word I, so it doesn't
Right.
matter. He
What does
he
that
agreed
mean?
to it being an anti-pattern.
What do you want? It's
I
Doesn't
just want
matter.
to know if you guys actually thought that was an anti-pattern, or if that was just a thing.
I think it's a thing, man. What do you think? Come on. You know that's not an anti-pattern. I don't even understand.
Come
how
on,
that
man. You
makes-
know it's just a thing.
It's just a thing. Ain't
Are
nothing
you
but
are
a
you
thing.
talking to me?
Yeah.
No, it's totally an anti-pattern because I just talked about it.
I'm gonna have a chat with Wikipedia about this one.
That's right.
Let's see here. The next one I got is interface bloat, making an interface so powerful that it's extremely difficult to implement. And this is similar to the God object that we mentioned earlier, which is like an object you kind of keep tacking stuff on until it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. There's some carryover there, but this is more specific about making like a pluggable interface that's got so much stuff in it that is, basically related to different types of tasks that it's really difficult and specific and unusable. So you've got a reusable interface for a component that's not very reusable. And an example here would be like if you've got a widget, like you've got a website, you've got some dashboards, and you've got a widget control. And so you say, I've got a widget class, and you can inherit it, and you can make a graph, or you can make a text area, or you can make, like a little export widget, something like that. But as you kind of go along, you start with having a render because everything needs to be displayed. Then you have a save in case anybody configures it. And you've got a restore to get anything that you've saved back. And then, you add an export, but the way you do that is by adding like an export method that now everything that shares this interface has to implement, and maybe it just returns null or does nothing. But then it's got, a flip to the right or rotate horizontal, and you keep kind of tacking on these abilities now to this common interface that it becomes kind of meaningless. And so now widget is just totally generic kind of bag of semi-related functionality. And now a new person comes along and says, okay, hey, I want to add a new widget. And they click, extend or implement whatever. And they get this list of stuff that now needs to be implemented. And half of it doesn't apply to what they want to do. Like they want to add a pie chart. And they're like, what's export mean here? What does save mean? I know what render means because that's all I cared about. But now I've got to implement all this other stuff. Or I have to maybe just have empty methods that do nothing and hope that nobody calls them and that they don't really matter. And so I think it's just a prime violation of the interface segregation principle, which is the idea of kind of having small interfaces that are targeted for the things that you actually care about. And one kind of example that I remember dealing with is I tried to implement iList once in C#. I had this bright idea of having something that could be like a list, but for some reason I wasn't just using a list for. I wanted to be able to mimic it, but also do other stuff. And there are tons of methods. I think there's like 24 or so methods in iList. And it's things like is read only, count, add, remove, index of. And knowing me, all I really wanted out of it was like IEnumerable, which gives you like count and a way to iterate through it. And maybe add, because add is like the one thing I think that's in list interface that isn't in enumerable. And I mean, if you just look at it, I'm not saying this is bad design, I'm sure it's like that for a reason, but when you go to implement something like that, if you want to make something that's compatible with the list interface in C#, you're going to be implementing a lot of methods. And as far as kind of telling if you're kind of going down this trap, I think if it's like once you get to the point where you're implementing something, so it's either an interface or you're inheriting something and kind of filling in like virtual methods or overrides, and you find yourself doing like little comments like this doesn't matter here, or throwing not implemented exceptions, or just defaulting to like basically null object behavior, then that's kind of a sign that your interface is doing too much and that you should consider kind of paring that down.
So I'm trying to think if I'm ever guilty of this, and I'm kind of wondering. So you gave your example about implementing the iList, and I thought like, oh yeah, that's probably like really hilarious if you were to implement your iList and then in your class you're using an iList. Right. And you're just like masking the functionality over top of it. And then I was like, oh wait, I think I've done something like that.
If you ever created like a sort of interface that like say you've got like an iProduct interface and it's got all sorts of stuff, and you keep finding yourself adding abilities to this common interface for things that are specific to certain types of products. Like let's say you're Amazon, and now you've added methods for like what's an example, like cut in half or reduce inventory. Like I'm sure you've seen systems where like you've got digital products in a database that has inventory. What do you set the inventory to? 0 or 1 or 99, -1? And it's just an example where you've got an interface that's more powerful, and it's kind of got properties or methods that are just nonsensical or difficult to implement for specific instances.
So I had a thought along these lines, and I'm wondering. So you tried to implement iList, and I'm just trying to think through this problem from the outside, right? So I believe iList is made up of a bunch of other types of interfaces, right? So it is going to implement IEnumerable, probably some other ones. So I guess here's my question with this, right? So you go down this path, maybe you just implemented the wrong interface, right? So I guess the heart of the situation here is, can you have a wrapper interface, like let's call it iList? Is that wrong to do, implementing a bunch of other interfaces to get a list of everything that you want to be enforced there? So I think it's raising an interesting question, because you can totally do that. You can create an interface that implements a bunch of other interfaces. You say, hey, I want this to utilize iDictionary. I want it to utilize IEnumerable. I want it to utilize whatever else. Is that wrong? I don't know if it is.
It's not. And I mean, it's okay if you're like building up on things. So iList specifically uses iCollection and IEnumerable. So in your example, you're taking like smaller pieces to create a bigger one, which that might be fine. But in the example that Joe's talking about, you just end up with like, you just keep tacking onto one thing, and you're never making an iSavable or an iExportable.
Right.
You're just like, oh, well, iWidget must have all these things.
Right. And I totally agree with that if you're building it yourself. But I'm just saying, from the example that you set out with doing iList, I think maybe you just went to too high a level when you were trying to implement, right? Because it's actually made up of two other ones. So it was just it was something I wanted to mention, because in this case, if you looked at iList and you tried to implement, you'd be like, wait, I don't need all this stuff, right? But under the covers, it's not doing all this stuff on its own. It's inheriting that or implementing that from other interfaces. So they kind of did it right. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, with third parties, you can't tack an interface on. So I couldn't create an interface that only had the methods I cared about and then, told whatever method, the third party method I'm dealing with that only takes the iList. I couldn't say, hey, iList, I know you only really need these two. So I made a new interface called add and remove. And that's what you should take instead. It just doesn't work like that. Like I've got to succumb to their interface. I can't change it. And I can't even change any sort of, types to apply my own kind of patterns to it. Like you have to play by their rules. And in this case, iList, there's a dozen different ways to do it. Like just use a list or maybe inherit from it. But I think just, passing a list is a much better way to go. So I don't know why I even tried that. I just thought it was kind of interesting to see just how much stuff there was that had to be implemented for something that I only use so little of.
Well, I mean, this is the example that I was thinking of was not iList, but iDictionary.
Yeah.
Where if you've ever tried
deal.
to implement iDictionary, there's a ton of methods on that one, and I've definitely had times where this is where my guilty confession here, as it relates to this, where like I wanted my object to look and act like a dictionary to the rest of the world, and so that's why I implemented iDictionary, but I wasn't recreating the wheel of how an iDictionary would work or anything like that. I just wanted mine to be used like a dictionary. And I'm trying to think if I even used a dictionary internally for any of the parts. I might have, or list as well. But so that's where you could get yourself into weird situations where it's like, oh, well, I don't want to support this particular, operation. I don't know if I did that, but...
Well, one example would be like, I've got some third-party method that takes an iDictionary of, string and string, and I want to make that dynamic. So I inherit from iDictionary or implement the iDictionary interface, and I create methods that actually run out to a database. And whenever you give me a key, and I return the value from the database, so it's like a dynamic dictionary. It's new. And whatever I'm passing, whatever third-party code is probably just using those indexers, right? It's probably just, using the same two methods that we always use for dictionary. But now, because you're doing that, you've got to implement all this other stuff like get hash code and whatever weirdo stuff that they're not even probably using. And it's because they're taking a bigger interface. They're not applying that interface segregation principle. They're taking something bigger than they need. And so it leaves you kind of stumbling around trying to implement the stuff that doesn't really make sense for your use case.
So I do want to come back just a little bit because probably if you're not familiar with interfaces and exactly how they work, firstly, I recommend going back to episode 1 because we talked about it, which has been a while back now. But yeah. I kind of want to tie this up a little bit. So we said that we started with this iWidget, and it started with a render call and then a save and then a restore and an export, and we kept adding stuff to it, right? The way that you would fix this problem is instead of having an iWidget with all those, you'd have an iWidget with a render call and maybe a couple others. And then if at some point you said that you wanted save, instead of tacking that onto iWidget as another method, you would probably create an iSaveable widget or something like that, right? And then that thing would have a save method. And then if at some point you said, hey, well, we need a restorable thing, then you might create an iRestorable widget. And then that way, any widget that you're creating could implement all those interfaces. So if you think about it like this, I have my new Pi widget, right? It'd be Pi widget colon, and then, iWidget, comma, iSaveable widget, comma, iRestorable widget, comma, etc. So I just wanted to at least wrap that up so that the anti-pattern is you tacking too much stuff into this one interface, and the way that you fix that anti-pattern is you create new, as you said, segregated interfaces so that now you just implement the ones that you actually need. And so you're keeping all your code extremely light and just focused.
Well, another way to say this too is that, and I don't know that we've ever gotten into this topic, maybe at a surface level, but if you try to be diligent about preferring composition over inheritance, right, then you could be setting yourself up to be in a good spot to already be creating the iSaveable and the iRestorable and the iExportable new interfaces, right? Because then when you want to add that new functionality, you're just going to add that composition into whatever new object you're wanting, right? Versus if you're just tacking it onto some base interface and then expecting that everything else is going to down the line
picks it up
that uses it is going to now have to be responsible for implementing it, right? And especially like that could be especially troubling too if you think about it from the point of view if you're like a package creator and you have some like core interface and instead of taking the composition route and creating this new interface that could be added onto other objects, you instead decide, okay, I'm going to take this core interface and I'm going to like add new methods to it that everybody's going to have to implement. You might not have access to all the source that's using your package so that you could even update those sources, right? So like you could be creating compilation errors for users of your package when they like pull down the latest version. So yeah.
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense. So you're talking about like public API or public type classes. People are using your stuff that you don't have control over anymore. Yep.
And not necessarily, it doesn't have to be public necessarily. It's like outside of your company or outside of your project. It could just be like, hey, I've got this NuGet package here that I've created, or this, whatever this package is, and it's going to be used in these other places. And I might have other people within the company that are also using that thing too.
Yep.
I might not have access to their code.
So what we're saying is lots of little interfaces are good.
We've gone full circle back to episode 1.
Yep. It's funny.
Tons of little interfaces that do nothing.
I had a discussion with somebody today, and it's frustrating because there's polarizing views on this stuff. We've talked about it before, and it drives me crazy. If you're doing OO by the book, let's call it, you're going to have a lot of classes. You're going to have a lot of files, right? If you're doing OO the not so much OO way, you probably won't have as many, right? Like by that, what I mean is this whole notion of separating your interfaces properly, you could end up with 5 files instead of 1, right? If you are doing abstractions properly to where you have a concrete class, as they call them, and you're trying to set it up to where you can do testing properly, you're also going to have an interface for that. So that's 2 files, right? Instead of the 1. And anytime I hear somebody argue about, well, you're going to have a bunch of files, I'm like, that's what your IDE is for, right? If that's the complaint, then that's a bad complaint, in my opinion. Like, I do agree that you don't want to get too complex with things, but on the flip side, do it in a way to where your abstractions are meaningful, and the number of files shouldn't dictate, at least in my opinion, should not dictate your direction for how you code these things. I'm curious your opinion.
My IDE has great tools for dealing with files. I've got tabs. I've got, right click, go to definition. I've got a little navigator window to the right where I can scroll up and down and see the files.
Or to the left.
Now, if I'm working, say what?
Or to the left.
Or to the left. No. I never mess with the defaults.
What? No, I'm thinking like...
He's thinking WebStorm or something like that versus Visual Studio.
Yeah.
There you go. Anyways,
I guess you're right.
Continue.
But I don't have great tools for dealing with big files. I've got Control F and like the mouse scroll. That's it. So if I need to go from line, wherever I am now to, like 10 inches up, the tools just suck for that. So
that's actually a really good point. Never really thought about it like that, but
it is definitely a pet peeve of mine. Like I see a lot of people that, developers that I truly admire, but for them, they find it, I don't know, I guess easier to reason about or whatever, where if they'll create like maybe a bunch of small classes, small interfaces, and they just leave it all in the one file. And
I've done it.
Bugs me. Like, yeah, I can't stand that. I'm like, no. That's got to be separate. I don't care how small it is. For all the reasons that Joe just listed.
I totally agree. Yep.
It's so much easier for me to deal with in that way. But, yeah.
Yeah.
There's something to be said for being able to read like top to down. So you enter a function and you keep reading until you get there. But like, who has time to read a 10,000 line function? I don't do that. I want to zip into the kind of the areas, and I want to use those hopefully good abstractions to help me get there quickly.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So anyway, I guess I'm going to get off my little soapbox there, but don't ever let the number of files be anything that dictates why you create something in a proper way. Like that argument kind of just sends me a little crazy. All right, with that, it's this time for us to first thank you, everybody who has seriously taken the time to remember after listening to us in the car on your long commute, whatever, for, literally when you get where you're going to take the time, get on your computer and write us a little review. It means more than you know. We don't ask for a whole lot. We try to give as much back as we possibly can. And this is the way that if you do want to give back to us, like, we appreciate it more than you could possibly know. So if you do remember this, please do head to codingblocks.net/review. And I think even /reviews works if you want to pluralize it. And, go up there and click on a link and either, leave us one in iTunes or Stitcher. It is more than appreciated, and we read all of them. We get emails as well, and we appreciate those. And thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. And please do, if you'd like to, share this with some other people, and make your life easier by helping somebody else code a little bit better for you. So that's all I got.
And with that, we head into my favorite portion of the show. Survey says.
Man, we need to get that ding sound from the show so that we can play it right here.
Yeah, we do. That'd be so awesome.
That would be.
All right. So last episode we asked. Okay, how to word this one. Okay, so you have 4 near identical job applicants come in for a job, and they only differ by how they learned to code. Which one do you hire? Your choices are: the first developer was a 6-week boot camper. Developer number 2, this does sound like a dating game. Developer number 2, a bachelor's degree from a state university.
Behind door number 3.
Yeah. Developer number 3 likes to take long walks. Developer number 3, 1 year similar job experience. And lastly, developer number 4 is a frequent committer to prestigious open source projects. I don't know why it has to be prestigious, but it is.
Popular open source. That's what we should have called it.
But we said
now.
prestigious.
It's too late now.
Well,
So
I've
there's
heard
your
about
4.
people copying and pasting other people's GitHub projects, throwing up on their own page, and then putting on the resume.
Yep.
Oh, that's a
So I
great
wanted to be able
idea.
to show, like, yeah, I know. You should do that. You should do that if you're getting your first
I
job.
wrote Kafka.
I'm going to go clone Joe Zach.
What, you didn't know?
That's awesome.
All right. So it's my turn to go first, right?
Sure, why not?
And I really have no idea on this one. I'm trying to think of what the listeners would say, somebody who was in a hiring position. My guess is they're going to go with the standard bachelor's degree.
Bachelor's.
And I'm going to say we're going to put that at 37%.
We went a roundabout way. I think we went through several numbers to get there.
We might have.
So 37% bachelor's degree.
Yep.
All right, Joe.
We got one really good comment about this, and I was hoping actually to get a lot more comments because I really want to know where these lines are, because I know this is intentionally kind of a tough question, right?
Right.
And the numbers are even hard. Like, if it was 2 years similar job experience, does that change things significantly? I'm interested in what these lines of distinction are. And I'd still like to hear it.
Joe
you should
looking
let
for a
us know.
job in HR.
Let's talk about our feelings. I'm going to say 1 year similar job experience with 51%.
Wow.
That's
You're
commanding.
going all in.
Go big or go home.
Yeah, apparently.
All right,
Go
so Joe picks 51% 1 year job experience. Alan, 37% bachelor's degree. And you're both wrong.
No.
It was a commanding 67% frequent
Whoa.
committer to prestigious open source projects.
Really? That
Holy cow.
is commanding.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah,
Wow,
that was
okay.
the one that mattered.
So for all the guys listening that have written us over the years and was like, hey, what should I do to get my first job? I think you have the answer now. mean,
And Joe gave you a great tip on how to boost up your GitHub.
Git download, copy
Git
all
clone.
the code to a new one.
Git clone Joe Zach. Git
man.
push Michael
yep.
Outlaw.
That's interesting. I mean, that's kind of exciting to me, honestly, that people actually care that much about it. That's, I mean, it does. I will say this: it does show a lot of different skills in one little thing, right? If you know how to, first off, clone the project, you know how to branch it, you know how to change the code, you know how to put it up, put in a pull request, get it approved. Like, that's a lot of little tiny skills that
Working
somebody
with
learned.
others.
Yeah, working with others. That's a lot of little things that you did to get your 1 or 2 or 200 lines of code in, right? It's not a small thing. So I like that. I like it that we were wrong, honestly.
Yeah, imagine like I'm trying to think of like a prestigious project like Firefox. So you get a resume in and it says like this person's a frequent committer to Firefox, and you can go and you can even see the communications and the like the mailing list stuff and that happens in the forums for the development for that and how they decide on making features and cutting tickets and getting things approved. And yeah, I mean I think that would be pretty huge.
That's excellent. Hey, what was number 2, just out of curiosity?
I mean, you still lost.
I know. Dude, 60 some odd percent just shocks me. Anyways.
No, Joe had it.
Did he really?
Yeah.
The 1 year? I was torn on that one. The only reason I said bachelor's was I was thinking some people value the fact that somebody put up the time to finish it, right? Like, because let's be honest, it's kind of a drag trying to get through all of it. And it shows a level of commitment. And that was the only reason I went with that.
Yeah, it was sad.
Significant?
Yeah, it was.
Really?
22%.
So bachelor's was like 10 or less.
Less, yes.
Wow.
Less. Yeah.
That's killer. That's exciting, man. That really is to me.
How'd boot camps do?
Not too well.
That was dead last, yeah.
Yeah, not too well.
Yeah.
I saw a lot of negative chatter on Slack about it. Like, a lot of people just didn't have great feelings or experiences with boot camp graduates. And that's not to demean anybody who ever got it done. That's nothing. It was some opinions being thrown around that, I was just kind of watching, but I think
it's important to know how other people kind of view that. And so if the only thing you've got coming into a job interview is a 6-week boot camp, then it's worth knowing that people value open source contributions. And so if you can buck up a little bit on some of those, then you're in a better position.
Agreed.
So for our next survey, with all the excitement and hype coming out around the iPhone 8, we ask, is this the iPhone we've always wanted, or is it just evolutionary and not revolutionary, or is it time to switch to Android? Those are the tough questions we ask.
Evolutionary, not revolutionary, like the MacBook Pro.
Time to switch. Please tell me what phone to buy.
Well, you know what, though? You were talking about last time that one of your reasons for wanting to switch was because they got rid of the headphone jack on it. But there's already, a couple of the Android phones that don't have it. I think it was like Motorola and an HTC that don't have it. The next Pixel is rumored to not have the headphone jack. So I think you're going to have that problem no matter which one you go to.
Everybody wants slimmer, and whatever.
Hashtag not my phone.
Right, exactly. Let's start a thing.
All right, so let's get into our latest fun here, which is Google Feud.
I'm ready. Got a new tab locked and loaded.
No, you're cheating.
No. Oh, I can't do it, can I? Oops.
Yeah, you're
I can't type it.
now all of your previous answers are suspect.
I've never won one. They can't be.
All right. So this is going to be not easy one, I guess. Why do programmers Google asked 100 users
suddenly appear
every time?
Show me suddenly appear.
How about make so much money?
Show me, why do programmers make so much money?
Dang it.
Oh, wow.
Why do programmers... I have no clue, man. Stink? Smell bad? Are they hygienically challenged? I'm not sure.
Jeez, Alan.
Yeah. We don't.
And you work at home, so what does that say?
I'm sitting in the same room with you. I don't smell anything, so we're good.
No. Okay, so here are the top 5 from my results. Why do programmers hate Windows? Why do programmers use Macs? Why do programmers use Linux? Why do programmers use Abstraction? And lastly, why do programmers use foo?
So it's interesting. Mine's mostly the same list, except I don't have the Windows thing, but I do have hate PHP as my last one.
Well, when I typed it in to just see, I inadvertently stumbled on something I didn't expect, which is that there's a language called Trump script. And it's not for dummies or losers. Makes coding great again.
Oh, I've heard of this.
No floating point numbers, only integers. America never does anything halfway.
Oh, man.
All numbers must be greater than 1 million. No import statements allowed.
Oh,
Oh my gosh.
Oh, man.
I do remember this now.
That's amazing. All right, we got another Google feud. Or
Okay, we got one more.
one more.
And this one is, why are programmers
Stubborn.
show me stubborn?
Dang it.
Joe?
Why are programmers so lazy?
We asked 100 people, Google's asked 100 people, and the survey says, why are programmers so lazy?
My first answer would have worked.
Number 1, why are programmers paid so much? Number 2, why are programmers so weird? Number 3, why are programmers fat? Hey. And number 4 and 5, why are programmers arrogant or so arrogant?
Man, isn't that sad that it's 2 of the top ones? Wow.
Yep.
Be aware. Be self-aware, people.
Self-aware.
Yeah, if you just are just getting into the profession, you're going to be paid well, but you're people are going to think you're weird, fat, and arrogant. Welcome to the club.
But what if you're just that good, though?
Right.
Yep.
Oh, here we go.
You don't have to like it. It's the way it is. Diddle-it, diddle-it, diddle-it.
Oh, man.
All right, so let's get this train back on the tracks.
All right, so I did have a weird one, and I remember it now. It's the magic push button. So they describe this as a form with no dynamic validation or input assistance, such as drop-downs. All right, so basically what they were getting at in this entire thing was you have this user interface and you have business logic, and the two are basically completely disconnected. The only way one gets used, the only time the business logic gets enforced or run is when you push the button on the form. And so what they're saying is everything in the UI has to be complete before you push the button, and then the business logic can run, and then after that, then it'll come back and do things. So this is where it started making sense, is what they're talking about is, you ever filled out a huge form on a page, and there's just so much garbage, and there's like 10 drop downs, each of them have 100 items in them. You get to the end of the page and you hit save, and then it kind of blows up and it's like, hey, this isn't valid. And you're like, what? What do you mean it's not valid? I just spent 20 minutes filling out this form. So what they're talking about is this magic push button is in a good type of UI, if you choose something and drop down one, like let's say Ford, right? Ford is the car manufacturer. Okay, well then probably Impala shouldn't show up in there. A GS350 shouldn't show up in that car drop down. It should limit it to what Ford cars are, right? You should see a Taurus, you should see a Crown Vic, you should see whatever else, right? And so what they're talking about,
You picked out some real winners there.
I did,
Ford,
right?
too.
Mustang, how about that? An F-150, the most popular selling vehicle
I
in
think
the
you got
United
it with
States.
the Crown Vic.
No, the F-150's
And
it.
the Taurus.
Yeah, there we go. Well, the SHO is not a slouch. Anyways, all right. So with that though, you could see where that would be incredibly frustrating. And we've all used interfaces like this where you choose something and it should have driven other options on the form and it doesn't. And so that's what they're talking about right here with this anti-pattern is there's zero feedback until you push that button. And then by that time, the feedback is almost useless, right? Because it's like, well, this isn't an invalid option. Well, how are you as the user supposed to know that only 10 out of these 150 cars in this drop down are legit based off what you chose in the other one? So that I totally agree. That's a bad user interface. That is an anti-pattern. You should somehow hook this thing up to where it can lead your users down a path, right?
Yeah, I don't really think of this as like a programming thing, though. This is kind of like a interfacey kind of, user input. Like, who likes users?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to pick on my input kludge, is this an anti-pattern or is this just an awful UI experience?
It's both. So the input kludge seems like, I guess the reason why I had a hard time with that one is that's not a pattern. That's literally just, you have a bunch of fields that have no way to validate properly, right?
No, they validate. They're just, you missed cases.
But this is literally a decision to where you're trying to separate your UI logic and your business, and you're being like fanatic about it, right? Like only when you click this button are we going to enforce the business logic because we want to keep the UI completely separated from the business, and that's why I think that's why I can see this as being an anti-pattern because it's almost like a strict decision that was made to make sure that we keep these things as uncoupled as possible or decoupled as possible. That's the only reason why this one sort of makes sense to me as an anti-pattern, is because it's not because they couldn't have done things in the UI to make it better. They just wanted to keep this nice, clean layer. This is your job and this is your job. So I think it's a pattern, a bad one.
We should have played pattern or thing for all of these guys, I suppose.
So what's your vote on this one? Pattern or thing?
Thing.
You? Yeah, I think you're a thing.
Yeah.
I could
UI.
follow. I could follow on both sides of this one. I could see where it's a pattern, but I'd probably lean more towards thing. All right.
Yeah, I just don't know about software engineering pattern.
Well, if you didn't think that input kludge was a anti-pattern and you're on the fence about the magic push button, let's talk about race hazard, also known as race condition.
Okay.
So this is the behavior of a system where the output is dependent on a sequence or timing from uncontrollable events, right? And it can often happen when processors or threads depend on some shared state. Now, you've probably been there, and if you haven't, you will eventually get there to a race condition problem where these can be difficult to reproduce. Don't look like that.
Yeah, this is a thing.
I see. No. No. You can't. You're already like prejudging. These can be difficult to reproduce, though, since the result is non-deterministic, and it often depends on the relative timing between threads.
Yep.
Yeah. You know what? I think this one is an anti-pattern because I think a lot of race conditions can be eliminated by doing things the right way, like using promises or like registering callbacks or doing those sorts of things. But a lot of times we get away with stuff until it becomes a problem, and we do things kind of in a bad way that relies on assumptions that we're making about the way things work that aren't necessarily true.
Which is why it's an anti-pattern.
Bah.
Because even Wikipedia says it is therefore better to avoid race conditions by careful software design rather than attempting to fix them afterwards. And because while you are trying to fix them afterwards, these production problems can often disappear when running in debug mode or additional logging is adding, situations like that, which is known as the Heisenberg bug, which is a bug that disappears or seems to disappear or alter its behavior when one attempts to study it.
Yeah, if adding an alert fixes your bug, then it's probably a race condition.
Come on, get on board. Get on board.
I could see where you could fix it with a pattern, but I don't see it as an anti-pattern.
Well, then if it could be fixed with a pattern.
You're relying on behaviors that isn't true. That's kind of been abstracted from you. But I mean, isn't that the point of abstractions? Is ideally you don't have to think about that stuff. You just kind of say like, "Hey, get my thing and use it." But that's not always available at the time, and you've made some assumptions about that.
Okay, that could lure me into the pattern, the anti-pattern. Okay, that was a good argument. All right, it's no longer a thing. All right. Like one kind of we mentioned like promises and callbacks, but another kind of thing is queuing, right? Like if you like try to make a behavior like you try to click a link in a navigation or try to do something before it's available, you could also queue it and say when the application is ready for it, go ahead and run through these actions that the user tried to do, or maybe just take the last one or something. So I feel like there are good tools for this, but a lot of times they involve like pretty nasty architectural changes, and so sometimes it's just easy to defer and literally run something later, which is a nasty solution to the problem, but it's very effective. Nasty.
The first are nasty.
That was amazing.
So the last one I got here are stovepipe systems. And this is something we've kind of talked about. I guess all these, there's a lot of overlap, but a stovepipe system is a barely maintainable assemblage of ill-related components. And stovepipes, the reason they call it that, or another word for it that I've heard more commonly is silos, is they're systems where features work up and down. Like every feature is almost like a copy-paste tweak of another feature. And so every time you add some new checkbox or some new section to a website or an application, you almost treat it kind of like it's almost standalone, where it's a part of the system, but it's not reusing common components that other things do. And so you'll find this a lot of times with the copy paste, like I mentioned, but it's because there's not proper abstractions and things aren't sliced up into modules or layers in such a way that I can reuse behaviors. And so the easiest thing to do then is just cut off a vertical slice that looks sort of like what I want to do. And I just make another one. And I've got this weird kind of like conglomeration of like, silos or stovepipes. And the problem there is that we're reinventing a lot of wheels. Especially if we're doing like a lot of ad hoc database calls, that's an example of somewhere that we're doing things when we need them and very specific to our needs, which is kind of nice, right? Because that means that those queries are very specific to what I want to do, and I'm not doing things inefficiently, or I'm not jumping through hoops that don't matter for me. So there are some benefits, but ultimately there's some pretty big downsides. I think anytime, for all these patterns, anytime you start copying and pasting and tweaking as like your main go-to, like you're into anti-pattern land. That's what I do all the time.
The funny part about that is what you just said, and this happens a lot of times when there's teams working on different sections of code, but
yes.
The tweaking is almost the most dangerous part, right? Because there's this pattern, let's say that people are familiar with, and then somebody copies and pastes it because they have this new section they need to work in, and they've learned some things since the last code was written, and they're like, oh, well, I can make this a little bit better, right? And so now you don't just have a copy and paste. Now you have this copy and paste, and it's slightly different. So it's not working exactly the way the other one did now. And so now you end up doing this because then somebody's going to copy and paste maybe that original source and do it slightly different in another place. And now you've got all these just slight derivations of the same type of code, and it's unfortunate. And it happens a lot.
I think I've got a real world example for this. Maybe. I think this one counts. Excuse me. So way back when with Stitcher, if you created your login, there was a certain set of criteria that it had for what it expected for the password, like what was acceptable and what wasn't in terms of character length and character class, whatever. If you then went over and like after you created your credentials, go over to the iOS app and then try to enter in those same credentials, then the rules for the password were different there. So even though one system accepted it and all the validation could have happened in one central place for like what's considered acceptable for the password, the other application had reinvented what the acceptable criteria was for the password. And even though it was the correct password, it wouldn't accept it.
That's frustrating when that happens. That happens in a lot of apps.
I think that counts as what you're talking about here, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Another example is like if you've got multiple drop downs where you can like say select a user, right, to perform some sort of action, and then somewhere along the line someone comes along and says, you know what, we've got soft deletes here, only show active users. You have to remember or know or search for every place that you've done an ad hoc query to get those users in order to only allow the ones that are active. And all it takes is one of those places to allow inactive ones. And now you've got this kind of weirdo record that is maybe not showing up. And so you go edit a record and there's a blank spot in the drop down that's required. Why is that there? So I think that anytime you've got to remember to do something in more than one spot, then you're probably you're looking a little stovepipey.
And the worst thing is, this is not an easy problem to fix, right? Like it really isn't, because in order to fix this whole, these silos or these stovepipes, you've really got to have some people take a look at the entire app as a whole and say, what's common here, right? What can we reasonably turn into reusable chunks of objects that can be shared or components or whatever. And that's not necessarily easy stuff.
I was thinking of all of the ones we've talked about, though, this would be among one of the easier ones, I would think, because I interpret this one as you get to delete a bunch of code.
Hopefully, right?
You're like, oh, hey, I see that you reinvented how we do password verification over here, and we have password verification over here, and this is the real business requirement rule, so I'm going to delete your method, and all calls are just going to use this other one, right? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we say this one's the most fun to correct.
Yes.
It's kind of rewarding too, right? Because when you do it right, you can drop them in. It might be a little frustrating while you're getting there, but
the delete key is my favorite key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. It's one of the reasons why I like software development, is because you can see things happen, right? Like when you look at that and you just chop the code base by 25% and it's working better and more testable and more effective
and more consistently,
you feel good about it, right? Like
that's the big one.
Yeah, you walk away from it like, I accomplished something great today, right? Like I not only is this working better, but now a bunch of other developers are going to come in here and benefit from this. And I've always enjoyed that whole molding and building aspect of this stuff. So yeah.
There are some benefits though. Like one thing is dependency hell. You can imagine like one feature of your site needs an updated version of like a JSON library. And so you update it and it breaks another section of your website that's using a different feature differently. And by having these things in silos, you're insulated from that sort of thing. So you can make changes in one area and not in another, which kind of sounds like a good thing, but it's a double-edged sword, because you don't want to have the same library, different versions used throughout your application. It's just asking for trouble as lines start kind of getting crossed. But it is kind of interesting to have those kind of vertical up and down, feature-wise, that flexibility.
It's like you said, they're almost insulated, right?
Yep. And you can also make sweeping vertical changes pretty easily. So if you need to change, that user drop down, like you could do whatever you want, and it's not really going to affect anything because, it's its own little slice.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap that up. So in our resources we like section, we will have a link to the Wikipedia article that we pulled some of these anti-patterns from, and you will be happy to know, Alan, that my boy Singleton is not on there.
Man, just Google Singleton anti-pattern.
No. Stop hating.
133,000 results in Google. Just saying.
It's a pattern. It's in the book.
It's
of
our
design patterns.
It's your boy. I'm not going to pick on him, but he's out there with anti-pattern written all over him.
No. He just gets picked on a lot.
He does.
All right. Well, with that, let's get into Alan's favorite portion of the show. It's the tip of the week.
I think it might be my second favorite. I really like Google Feud a lot.
Google Feud
I do enjoy it. I do.
Has caught up, huh?
It has. It's up there.
And it looks like I'm first this time. And I found something kind of interesting here, and I've yet to try this out, so hopefully it still works. But the tagline is setting a Skype status from the command line. And I've got a little gist here, and it's Bash, but I've also got a little C# project here. And I imagine there's some other way to do it here, so we'll have some links. But it's like the idea of like setting your command line either dynamically, setting your status dynamically, or just kind of having some fun with it. So you could do something like, I don't know, if you're you write a little program that sees how long you've been on a branch, and if you've been on a branch for more than one day, your status could be, I'm still working on this freaking branch, or even having just the branch that you're in and your main kind of repository being a part of your status message is kind of interesting that anyone could like look at your name in Skype and just see what you're working on without having to ping you. So I just thought it was kind of cool, and you could even have like bring in your calendar or whatever. So now it's showing when you're at lunch or a doctor's appointment or stuff like that. So it's kind of cool. And if you just, take it one little malicious step in another direction, you could also have, stuff like it's signing on for you at certain times or auto responding.
That's cool. That's a nice, fun one.
Yeah.
Mine is only because I don't think we've talked about it before, and it's come up. And Joe, I think you've had some real nice experience with this. So a lot of times what you'll see if people have a list of things that they need to push into a stored proc in SQL Server, a lot of times what you'll see is they'll just create this long string that's some sort of character delimited, whether it's pipe or comma or something, and then they'll parse that out in SQL using something like a split function and turn it into rows, right? So that can work. Performance may not be great, but that's one. But then typically if you need related data being pushed into a stored proc, right? Like, so maybe you have a user ID and then along with that, you need to pass in, I don't know, his name or something, right? But you have a whole list of them like in a table. The way that I've seen it done in the past is you might pass in two extremely long strings that are, pipe delimited or something, and then you try and match them up when you get into the proc. So there's a better way to do that, at least with SQL Server, and this might actually be implemented for other RDBMSs using ADO.NET and C#. But you can do what's called passing in a table valued parameter for SQL Server. And the only downside to this is you have to create, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you have to create a user-defined table type in SQL Server. So let's say that it was like, user ID, first name, last name. You'd have to set up that special table definition so that SQL Server could be aware of that type. But then you could literally pass an entire data table into SQL Server, and it could use it just like it was a table valued variable in SQL Server. So it's way faster than string parsing, and you get the benefit of having related records really in a true table format when you get in there.
Yeah, I feel like we should talk about this common delimited list as an anti-pattern. You want to go over that one real quick?
It should
Is
totally
it an anti-pattern or is it a thing?
It might be a thing. I don't know. It depends on the server. Like I don't know if like MySQL supports things like this because I don't know that they necessarily support like user-defined type tables or whatnot. But I really should probably look into that. But anyways, I have a link on here for this, and if you're using SQL Server and you find yourself passing in crazy strings, you should probably look into this because performance and safety and et cetera, you'll find this to be useful.
Yeah, it's shockingly slow, or so shockingly surprising to me how slow SQL is at dealing with lists. Like you would think it'd be not a big deal, but I've had so much better experiences with UDTs. And just like every other anti-pattern that we kind of talked about, I should say that I do that one in particular. I've done many, many times, and I've done all these patterns a lot. Like we tend to talk about best practices, but I always want to make sure to point out that like I absolutely do all the things I'm advising you not to do.
I can't talk to you anymore.
Oh no.
Stay out of my God object.
That's right. That's right.
All right. So for my tip of the week, this is for the Mac users. So every time it's time to do your software updates, typically just wait for the little App Store thing to chime in and say, hey, you got an update, right? And then you watch it, and then there's that time where it's like, oh, well, you gotta like download this and reboot, and so then it kind of goes into this like quasi shutdown mode, gray screen. You watch it download for 30 minutes, and then, well, not anymore, but you watch it download for 30 seconds, and then it installs for another 10 minutes, and then reboots, and all is well, right? So 9to5Mac posted this conversation or summary of a conversation that happened on Reddit, where the conversation was about using the terminal to do this all from the command line with just the software update command. And in typical Reddit fashion, it exploded into this amazing, everyone trying to one-up it, because it started out as, oh, hey, you could do a software update -L just to see if there's some updates. And then if there are, you could do a software update -I-A to install them. And people were like, no. We gotta consolidate these commands, right? So I'll include a link to it. You can see the whole evolution of the commands. But yes, basically the point is you could do all your software updates by the final command, which was, I'm going to say it out loud, but then know that you'll be able to read this article. Sudo sh space, or well, let me rephrase that. Sudo space sh space -c, and then in double quotes, software update -ia and reboot. So basically the idea is that you could execute in a whole new shell, sudo shell, these two commands that are chained together, so that if the first one actually has an update and succeeds, then it will reboot. And that is Reddit for the win. Now you can do your software updates from the command line.
That's pretty beautiful, I gotta say.
Right?
I can't take you seriously when you pronounce it like that.
What?
Sudo? Seriously?
How would you say
pseudo. I'm pseudo. You?
Pseudo?
Yeah, pseudo.
Pseudo? All right. Yeah.
But I think it is actually supposed to be sudo, right? But I always say pseudo.
Yeah.
Super user do.
Yeah, super user do, but it's pseudo.
Yeah, okay. Okay, fine. I've been shamed.
Is it GIF or GIF?
Whoa. Whoa, no. It's choosy hackers choose GIF.
It's never gonna end.
So tonight we talked about software design anti-patterns. We talked about our favorites, which ones were things, which ones we hated the most, and which ones we do the most often.
Which ones are things? Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and so with that, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app. Be sure to leave us a review by visiting www.codingblocks.net/review.
While you're there, check out our show notes, examples, discussions, and more.
Send your feedback, questions, and rants to the Slack channel, codingblocks.slack.com. And make sure to follow us on Twitter at codingblocks, or heading over to codingblocks.net, and you find all sorts of social links and things like YouTube stuff. Need more Diet Dr. Pepper.
Tastes like the real Dr. Pepper.